Okay, so I kind of missed the setup process, but I'm gonna actually be pulling off the suspension from this car and putting it on this one. This one actually has drift spec coilovers, nothing crazy, just some CX Racing coilovers with some, I think, Swift springs. Always use your jack stands if you have them. If you don't have your jack stands, just try and make sure you put something up under the car. That way, if you're using a jack and it fails, you have something that's going to keep you safe. Like, because you don't want to mess up and have your legs crushed or anything like that, because that'll put a dent on any and everything that you're doing. So the way I'm doing this is to work in stages. I have 4 jack stands, 2 for this car, 2 for the second car, so that way I can actually take the suspension off, put it on, put that suspension on here without having to drop one car and pick one up. So always try and get more jack stands than you need, so that way you kind of never really have to stop, per se. Also, on a side note, when you guys are working, try and stay hydrated. It's so easy to remember to get out there and start working, but it's always hard to remember to stay hydrated. So if you have something to drink, make sure to bring it with you. I'm probably pretty bad at taking stuff off and actually explaining what I'm doing, but try and bear with me. It's my first time actually vlogging or anything like that, so just bear with me. So for the most part, what we're going to do is going to be like any other brake job as well. So we're going to take off these 2 bolts on the top, which actually hold the slide pin. So you're going to take the slide pin out. It's going to actually release the caliper itself. Then we're going to take off the bracket bolts, which are 2 17mm bolts down here. It's probably really hard to see, but 2 17s down here. And then we're going to take off this full caliper assembly, and then after that we should have enough clearance to really get to the strut itself. We really don't have to take anything off to get to it, but it might make it a little bit easier just to do it in the beginning, that way you don't have to worry about it later. So now that I've gotten the 2 front coils out, these 2, it's time to actually put it on that car. So the process is the exact same. Okay, so in hindsight, I actually remembered how I did this. And to get the stock suspension out, you want to actually remove the bolts to these 2, or to the upper control arm, so that way you can give yourself a little bit of wiggle room to drop the suspension down. It's not going to damage anything since your alignment is measured by the bolts at the bottom. So just give yourself a little bit of wiggle room by dropping these 2 bolts, and you'll be set to remove the stock suspension, because it's going to be a lot taller than aftermarket suspension. So on this chassis, I actually broke the bolts loose already, started to jack up the front. So we're just going to jack up the front, remove the stock suspension, and I'll show you how I did it, and then we'll go from there on the installation. Okay, now that the car's jacked up, let's get these coilovers on. Alright, set you guys up. Okay, so step one to getting these off, you actually want to unbolt the sway bar end link. So it's going to be one 10 mil nut and one 10 mil bolt that actually goes through to the back side of the sway bar end link. So you unbolt that, and then secondly, you want to actually remove this so that it gives you a little bit of slack. You can either do it right here or on the actual frame rail. And then you want to undo the upper control arm and loosen the lower control arm, so that way, the lower control arm down here, so that way you can get a little bit of drop in the suspension, so that way you can remove the actual strut. And this will, by removing the upper control arm bolts, you'll actually be able to swing the upper control arm out of the way, so that way you can actually move it, because this spindle will block you the whole time. So let's get to it. Okay, we're almost there. I had to fight with the bolt to get out, but we're actually gonna have to take off my strut brace. I actually got it off my old car, but yeah, we're just gonna take off the strut brace, remove the top, the strut nuts, and it should fall out the bottom, giving us enough clearance to kind of pull it out of the strut assembly. There we go. The strut slid down out of the housing about an inch or a half inch. So now we just kind of press down on the suspension to get it to drop out a little bit further. Now that the upper control arm is fallen out, we should be able to just kind of slide this down and pull it out. But don't be like me and forget the lower strut mount bolt. Alright, so when you're doing this and you don't unhook the brake line, just try and keep it with a little bit less tension than you normally would. But after that, once you get the bolt out, or the lower strut bolt out, you can just kind of pick it up and kind of slide it to the side, and out she comes. So now that we got the strut out, we can actually take a look at it. And I can see a lot of the slop in the suspension was probably coming from the bushing right here. Apparently the Sport Design suspension is actually a little bit stiffer than the regular GS300 suspension, but when it has bushings that are kind of worn out like that, you can kind of argue that it pretty much feels like a regular GS on okay suspension. But seeing as these are probably the stock struts and the car is almost 20 years old, it's probably time to replace it.